PD session for T-Level Education and Childcare, and it's a subject specialist session related to exploring attachment theory. My name's Helen Scanlon and I'm part of the provider development team, and we support the T-Level centres delivering the Education Childcare T-Level programme and technical qualification. Today with us we've got Janet King, the Sector Manager for Education Childcare, and Stacey Mann, the Subject Specialist. I'm going to hand over to Janet and Stacey to run through today's session.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this webinar today. So, as you can see, we're going to be exploring attachment and attachment theories. And so if we start off by looking at some of those intentions through those aims and objectives, we're going to consider the attachment theories that can be used in education and childcare, and of course we'll make some specific references to the attachment theory and the qualification specification for the T-level qualification in education and childcare. That was a mouthful. We'll also describe how attachment theories can be applied in practice. And then we'll look and reflect on how effective key person systems are and how they can be improved using the theories of attachment, so helping to make those significant links to modern day teaching and learning and practice in education and childcare settings. Thank you, Helen. So, how does it then, how does the attachment theory link to that specification? So that takes us to element 7 in the core, which is looking at child development, and specifically the outcome 7.2. The student must understand the key concepts of attachment theory and how early attachment can influence adult relationships, and the reference that should be made to those following theorists, and these won't come as any surprise. So those traditional theorists that we automatically sort of think about when we think about attachment, and that of course is John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, Michael Rutter, and Schaffer and Emerson. So we're going to, there's also links with the actual occupational specialism in the performance outcome, and this is for the early years educator performance outcome, I believe, and that's about developing relationships with children to facilitate their development. So we're looking at the core, and there's also significant links there with the occupational specialism as appropriate. I'm now going to hand over to Stacey, and Stacey will take you through some theories on attachment. Thanks, Stacey.
Thank you, Janet. It is important to have a sound understanding of attachment in early years, including how this can be impacted on practice. And to do this, attachment theories can be explored with key points taken from some of the studies carried out by key attachment theorists, which we're going to go through today, and reflected on to indicate any areas of improvement. By having a good understanding of attachment and appreciation for working with parents as well as for the child's holistic development, the outcomes for the children will be as positive as they can be. Attachment theory will underpin the key person approach in early years settings and ensure that the procedure is aligned with the appropriate policy. The new Early Years Foundation stage that came in September made no changes to the key person approach. This is still as important as before. The theories of attachment, like a lot of theory, can be heavy and difficult to understand, but by ensuring this is balanced with sound examples, the learning will be cemented. Equally, the negative outcomes that come from poor attachment also need to be understood. Throughout this session, we will be discussing case studies to ensure that theories are understood and so that they can be implemented into the classroom too. Settling into a setting for the first time, or even if the child is moving from room to room, procedures should be in place to support the settling in period. Some children find settling in difficult, and this can be highly emotive for everyone involved. Leading with compassion in these circumstances is so important, and having a clear understanding of attachment theory will support that. We're now going to take a look at a scenario which I would like everyone to join in with. You can use the chat box to answer the questions to this. If we can just have the next slide, please, Helen. So Clara is 9 months old and is starting day nursery for 2 days a week. Her mum is returning to work and she has 3 settling in sessions planned in with the new setting. Clara is restless and agitated when being dropped off at the setting and is difficult to settle until her key person arrives. Why do you think Clara responds so well to her key person? Because as it says there in the case, in the scenario, she settles down when the key person arrives. So why do you think Clara responds well to her key person? Just wait for some answers to come through there. The relationship with the key person, and that she feels comforted. So what is it that that key person might be doing that the other people aren't doing? How has that relationship been built? So Clara needs security, she needs comfort, she also needs empathy. I think a lot of us go into that mode of it's okay and saying to the children it is okay. Well, actually for them it's not okay, and this is a really great time to actually name some of the emotions, to be able to tame some of those emotions. So empathy and understanding is really key there. Routine and giving lots of time to that child will also help to establish a routine and get her to settle a little bit better. Adult interaction is very, very important, and the quality of that adult interaction. Also thinking about peer interaction. So has she got someone to play with? Do we have a really good memory to make sure that we are remembering what she likes to play with and making sure that that's out on those 2 days a week that she's there? She responds well to her key person because she must have spent time with the key person and the mum together, so that all 3 of them have got this interaction going on where modelling best relationships are there. The key person has shown empathy with Clara and comforted her when she has been upset. So I think this is a really good way of getting the students to understand what might be going on within attachment theory, but also how that can impact practice as well. So every single one of the students who are in placement will have seen or been part of this sort of scenario. I'm now going to pass back to Janet, who is going to take you through a few of the theorists.
I'm just going to jump
you.
in a second. Sorry, we've got a question coming in about any theory related to how to best identify the key person to work with, Clara.
Usually in settings, there wouldn't be maybe not a theory that would be related, because all of the theories will sort of cover the same sort of areas, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But in terms of who the key person is going to be, we will have a look at the early years foundation stage and what that says about key person. But a lot of settings will adopt an approach of seeing who the child settles with best. So there's a few different ways that settings will look at who the key person is going to be. If they go for an approach where they leave it for a couple of days to see who that child bonds with best, you know, and sometimes it can be really what looks insignificant to us. It could be, I remember having a little girl who just settled really well with me because I'd got the same colour hair as her mom. So she sort of had that relationship with me straight away, and because I was the first person to speak to her mom, so then I was given that child as my key child. Other settings will do it by numbers, unfortunately, because they will, you know, they've got so many children, they'll go, right, you've got 12, you're in on the same days as that child, and let's do that. And then it takes a bit of time if they haven't bonded straight away. But I think a lot of this around how best to identify the key person is about self-reflection. So thinking about, why are all these children going to this one person? What is that one person doing that is different to what I'm doing? Or why are all these children coming to me? You know, what is it that I'm doing that's best practice that I can share with my colleagues? So I think there's a lot to unpick with who is best to identify the key person. And then as we go through, it might be that you identify some theories that do align with that as well.
Lovely, thank you, Stacey. That can really help provide our centre's staff with teaching and learning ideas related to this context and this element and occupational specialism area. So thank you. And I'm just going to just remind everybody, if you do have any questions, please do pop them into the question box. Thank you.
Thank you. And just on that point, you know, where we're thinking about the theory and we're thinking about the key person, there's obvious links that can be made when you're in that teaching and learning environment with students, that a key person, yes, they've got that responsibility, they're looking after a named number, if you like, of key children, but also reflecting, as Stacey said there, on the importance of that responsibility, and absolutely recognising the theory, as Helen has said, the importance of thinking about what this theory is telling us about the criticality of that relationship and how important that is for how a child feels, how a child is building their own sort of identity and self-worth and so on. That relationship is incredibly powerful, and so that role of key person is a very serious one, and the theory certainly does inform that. I just want to say thank you, Stacey, for sharing a scenario, because I think before we move on to other types of things that we can do, because the scenario approach is something that's used, isn't it, in that employer set project. So yes, all of these things that Stacey and I and Helen are talking about today on the webinar, as tutors, you know all of this, but I think what can be rich is just remembering that there are many ways in introducing what can be quite complex theory for younger students to take on board when they hear the word theory for the first time. It can be quite overwhelming. So to think about this in real context and use scenarios not only makes sense of what is a complicated world for young learners, but also sets the scene for what actually is going to be part and parcel of that employer set project, where we're looking at scenarios in context. So all of these things are a really good idea to be able to think, what is attachment? What is the theory? But how can we see that actually working in practice through a scenario? Is all good. Other things that you can do, and there's another example here on the slide, which is a bit of a research task for students. So students will need to have access to the internet, textbooks and so on to support some independent research. And again, not only is that allowing them to find out more and read wider about a topic or a subject area within this element, but it's also preparing them to become that autonomous learner. Working in small groups to be able to do this enables that peer confidence, that collaboration, all of which are needed as part of the external assessment. So it's a good thing to be able to build these skills and to make sure that each individual student is capable and confident in how they gather information. So that's another type of skill. And then being able to use that, being able to use the research that they have and apply that to perhaps following on from a scenario like Clara and her situation, and bringing it back to the theory and how we can see that is all good preparation, all good formative assessment in preparation for that employer set project, for example, as well as really digging in to the importance of attachment and any questions that might come up in an exam situation around the attachment theory as well. So again, making sure students have got access to the resources that they will need. They could then split into small groups, they could work independently, they could work offline. This is something that could work through a blended approach, for example, and they could research the following theorists or one of, depending on how you wanted to share this sort of task out. And then they could present some of that. They could summarize some of that. You know, what have they found? Have they found a little bit of background to that theorist? Have they found a little bit of sort of main points and key contributions that theorist has applied through their theory? And how might that work in practice? have there been any criticisms to that theory? So it can really evolve into some sort of debate as well. And of course, element 9 involves some aspects of reflection and thinking about current trends in early years and childcare as well, in education and childcare. So you can bring elements of that in there. So let's think about those criticisms. Why do you think people criticised? Oh, and why do we not take theory as a sort of truth, you know, and we look at this as an evolving pattern? Why do we do that? So that's a really important aspect of opening people's minds as well, where real learning and opinion, you know, what do your students think? You know, do they agree with this? Do they not agree with that, with some aspects of it? Why not? And those are all good things to develop confidence. So you could allow time, of course, for that to be completed. And students could perhaps present their work, they could use PowerPoint, they could create handouts, they could have debates, and all of that is developing a richer understanding of the topic area, but also developing confidence in themselves to challenge a theory or to say why they agree with a particular aspect. So it's developing that side as well as enhancing those sort of general competencies around English and digital skill as well. So let's have a look at the sorts of things that we might do there. So if we think about John Bowlby, for example, here, so beginning with Bowlby, it's difficult, as I say, to discuss the attachment theory without thinking about the work that Bowlby carried out and contributed. And it's continually analysed, it's continually brought up and used in early education. So these are the sorts of things that students may well find when they're doing their research. So Bowlby, a psychoanalyst, he believed that mental health and behavioural problems could be attributed to early childhood. His work around the attachment theory is still very relevant in today's practice in terms of how it contributes to the way that modern practice is working. So some key concepts and research words that we've got there that are on the slide: innate attachment to one figure, that biological survival need that that babies have to be able to make an attachment. And of course, then you're thinking about how that could maybe bring in to complement that and to show that. You've got the work of Harlow. You could look at Harlow. You could look at the experiment with the monkeys and you know, the feeding and the cage and the towel that was wrapped around, and the fact that actually love and attachment became as significant, if not more significant, than food, and the critical importance of innate attachment is made clear through that experiment. So you can look at images, you could look at further experiments, of course, to, like Harlow, to make that point and to bring that home, and again to initiate debate, to bring out conversations around the theory. You know the theory, we know the theory. How do you make that come alive and engage and turn the light on for theoretical hunger, if you like, with your students? Maternal deprivation, of course, being one of those issues that, you know, it's the attachment to the mother, and that was later seen as the importance of the primary caregiver, and that was sort of brought on board with criticisms and also further work by Rutter and so on, and Robertson you could look at as well, the importance of the primary caregiver. So there are concepts that are introduced through Bowlby that have gone through many evolutions of thought processes, but things that you could anchor to other theory, to developing theories, to timelines of bringing us up to more modern day thinking. So a good starting point is to explore these and to allow students to debate the sort of biases around this thinking about that, you know, the most of this work was done in the 1950s. So thinking about, you know, post-war Britain, thinking about the way that society was arranged in terms of you know, societal roles and so on. Very interesting to bring that into the context of the work of John Bowlby and open up that richer thinking from a sociological perspective. And of course, the internal working mode, those needs the intrinsic needs and the that are formed around attachment. So Bowlby defined attachment as a lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. And he proposed that attachment can be understood within an evolutionary context, that the caregiver provides safety and security for the infant. Really important when we think about John Bowlby to appreciate that the critical breakthrough, if you like, was that importance of responding and investing in the child's needs. That if a child is speaking to you, if a baby is speaking to you through crying, then they are actually trying to communicate to you. You wouldn't ignore those communications. You invest the time, and that will reap the reward through a strong attachment. And these are the sorts of things that Bowlby is saying here. So how does all of this apply to practice? The key person approach is a key element of working with babies and young children. The understanding of attachment theory is important, critically important, to be able to build relationships that are of any meaning and of any value, and to identify when there may be cause for concern. The benefits of strong attachments can support all areas of development. And that's, quite a massive statement. So you could explore that with students. So the way somebody feels affects every single aspect of their development. Why? How? How do we feel if we are upset, if somebody has said something to us, or we suddenly feel that we're not part of something? You can bring it into that sort of adolescent world in terms of relationships and so on, and when things go wrong. And then you're thinking about, how does a child feel when they can't communicate these things, or when they're carrying the burdens of adult life? So the benefits of strong attachments can support all areas of development, crucial to understanding the significance, I think, of that key person role. And of course, children will go through stages of attachment, and this is key to supporting their overall well-being and holistic development. So these things don't just happen, as Bowlby said, this biological need, they are craving that attachment, through that sort of the primary caregiver is investing all of that time. Now, what Bowlby was saying is that it's the mother. He started off by saying it was the mother. So Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypotheses suggests that continual disruption of the attachment between infant and primary caregiver, and his original work was mother, hence the maternal deprivation, could result in long-term cognitive, social, and emotional difficulties for that infant. And Bowlby originally believed that those effects will be permanent and irreversible. And he was actually convinced then that young babies, young children that had got any form of long-term disruption to their attachment would become, he used the word juvenile adolescence in terms of criminals and taking wrong paths and so on. But he was almost saying that that was a given. Now, there are many criticisms to that, and of course, attachments can be interrupted. Attachments don't always naturally form, and we can, again, something to debate. But what he was saying and what he was emphasizing is the importance of that critical bond. So a study called the 44 Thieves was carried out, and the aims of that was to determine the correlation, or any correlation, between maternal deprivation in infancy and adolescent delinquency, as they say. So Bowlby studied a group of 44 juvenile thieves who attended a child guidance clinic, and subsequently compared them with a control group of 44 who, though emotionally disturbed, did not steal. So interesting. And the findings were that 14 of these individuals were classified as affectionless, compared with none in the control group. And that's an interesting word, isn't it? This apathy, this inability to think, of affection, this lack of empathy, and so on. 17 of the thieves had been separated from their mother for more than 6 months before they were aged 5, compared with only 2 who had experienced such separation in the control group. And Bowlby concluded that there is a correlation between maternal deprivation in infancy and subsequent criminal activity in adolescence. Now, taken on its own findings, they do indicate a link between maternal deprivation and criminal behaviour. So it's worthy of looking at that. But again, taking that as a sort of way of emphasising the importance and the criticality of attachment. So the study relies on the recollection of participants, and of course that could weaken in the reliability of the results. But it's an interesting concept and an interesting way of bringing those things into light. So let's move on now then, and let's think about Mary Ainsworth. So Ainsworth was a developmental psychologist and known for her work on the attachment theory. And of course, the main thing that Ainsworth looked at was the strange situation. Now, I don't know if we have a little video clip of the strange situation.
Janet, I have the link, but I can't run it through here without downloading it.
No problem. So we can make sure that that's accessible, and that's something that you could look at and you could share, because you'll know about the strange situation anyway, and how that works, and the different sorts of situations, if you like, that the children were put in with their primary caregivers staying and leaving the room and so on. So all of those things can be seen in the video, and it's a useful way of, again, of thinking about the importance of attachment and identifying the strength of an attachment. Now, none of these things can be sort of, that must be a poor attachment, that must be an incredibly strong one, because we're dealing with people, and you can't put 100% on something like this, but it gives a strong indication, and therefore you can again think about that criticality of attachment through that. So if we think about some of the benefits of attachment, then we're thinking about some of those things, again, coming back to what Stacey was saying, and emphasising the sorts of things that Bowlby and Ainsworth were also saying about attachment: security, emotional security. These are big things. Comfort, co-regulation, the importance of that primary caregiver, meeting those needs, being there, a sense of belonging. These aren't things that just belong with children, are they? Self-esteem, self-confidence, independence, socialization, and all of those things that deal with attachment, of course. Yes, we're expecting those key people to be able to provide this security and this to allow for co-regulation and so on. But what we've also got to be mindful of, I think, what it reminds me of anyway, and helps me to reflect of, is that when we're teaching, this is the sort of thing that's more important to get right than anything else. We need to develop that relationship with our students, so that they feel able and confident, and feel valued, and a sense of belonging within their peer groups and also with you. And that's another part of teaching that is so important, which you will know. But it brings that sort of, again, brings it into the conversation about the importance of feeling that sense of belonging in social situations, and when you don't, how that makes you feel. And that can help students to relate to the idea. So some of the factors that could affect a secure attachment, again, according to the theory and the notion of separation, being apart from the primary caregiver. And the theory would suggest that that needs to be prolonged. So we're looking at more than 6 weeks. But we know, of course, that doesn't mean that that's therefore impossible to create an attachment. But what it does mean is that you need to do it, and you need to make sure that that attachment is strong. We can have lots of weak attachments. We can know lots of people, but not feel attached to them. And that's, again, something to debate. Another factor that could affect a secure attachment: what about the parents' sort of well-being? Mental health, postnatal feelings, learning difficulties, substance abuse, dependency on alcohol, and so on and so forth. If parents don't feel strong, then they're not going to be able to invest the energy, and it takes energy to create those early attachments, that investment in time, and it takes support. What if there's no support network? How difficult is this going to be? How can we help when we're in a key person role? How do professionals help? What's this sense of community and intervention? What's available to support them? What about COVID? How has that interrupted these very vital services when a parent is finding it difficult to cope in very difficult circumstances? So again, all of those things. What about, if we think back to Bowlby's work, what about those young, well, I don't know why I'm saying young parents. What about those parents? I apologize because I don't mean that at all. What about those parents who are actually may have struggled themselves with attachment and feeling this sort of lack of empathy, and unable therefore to actually appreciate the importance of their role? Abuse and neglect and the cycles that brings. Coping with a baby that's been born with special educational needs and disabilities. Again, it can interrupt the attachment in those early days, and that could be because of separation, because the baby may need some medical intervention and intensive care periods, for example. Premature birth is another example, or it could just be that has been a shock to the parents, and therefore there is difficulty in forming that early attachment, and there's a need for extra support. Recognizing all of these things. And of course, as well as special educational needs, disability, and all the other things we've just talked about there, just general ill health, and it could be ill health of the primary caregiver, it could be ill health within the baby that's making those demands more challenging, difficult to feed, and so on. There's so many things that can interrupt that bond, and because it's having an impact on primary caregiver and young child. So things to talk about and things to discuss, and how, that's not the end of the world. What can we do about that? And the interventions and the role of the key person, again, made more significantly. You'll find there on the bottom of this slide a link to that video that will explore that strange situation and how Ainsworth, sort of carried on the work of Bowlby, if you like, and was thinking about, well, how can we test those different stages of attachment, and how can we test a strong, secure attachment and a weak attachment, if you like. And so that might be a useful resource. I'm now going to hand over to Stacey, who's going to look at Rutter. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Janet. So Michael Rutter is the first appointed professor of child psychiatry in the United Kingdom, or was. He sadly died in 2021. Rutter reassessed Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation and the effects on the child. So some key concepts and some research words that you could look at here are the distinction between privation and deprivation. So deprivation as losing something in which a person once had, whereas privation might be defined as never having that something in the first place. Privation is, he found, far more detrimental than deprivation. And he wrote a book called Maternal Deprivation Reassessed. And in the book, he suggested that Bowlby may have oversimplified the concept of maternal deprivation. And I think just building on what Janet was saying there about some of the factors of that could affect a secure attachment, there's other things that we can start to look at there, such as the plasticity of the brain and looking at neuroscience and looking at how we can build relationships within the setting, but also there's adverse child effects that we could look at, and there's a wonderful YouTube clip on by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talking about ACEs, and that can really sort of support all of those different areas that might affect a secure attachment. Bowlby used the term maternal deprivation to refer separation from an attached figure, a loss of attached figure, and failure to develop an attachment to any figure. These each have different effects, argued Rutter, though. So in particular, Rutter distinguished between privation and deprivation, as we said. So there's quite a lot here that we can explore, we can research, and is very current. Rutter also argued that if a child fails to develop an attachment, then deprivation might be defined as losing something in which that person once had. And as we said, the privation might be defined as never having that something in the first place. So there's arguments there for against Bowlby's work, but also building on Bowlby's work. So quite a lot to have a look into and link to current practice. So then we might move on to Schaffer and Emerson, and they investigated that if attachment develops through a series of stages, by studying 60 babies at monthly intervals for the first 18 months of life, known as a longitudinal study, they found lots of different stages of development progress. So they looked at the 4 stages of developmental progress. Babies are more likely to form attachment with carers who are responsive and sensitive, and I think that's definitely something that you can link to practice. I also used to link it to the classroom itself. So, you know, what do I do as a teacher when you all come into the classroom? I acknowledge everybody, I smile at you, I say hello, I might remember something that happened the day before. And actually, how does that make you feel in the classroom? It might make you feel safe. It might make you feel happy to answer questions and talk about how you're feeling. It might be that you feel comfortable in then asking a question if you don't fully understand something. So you can talk about the impact that that has on the student, and they can feel that, and then obviously that will cascade down to when they're working with children as well. We also must remember that those 4 stages of developmental progress can go back to another stage, especially if a stage is missed. So, for example, with any stages of development, we have the sequence is the same, but the rate of the child does those developmental milestones are different. So if a stage is missed, such as, let's look at physical development. If a child starts walking before they can crawl, for example, you will find that at some point later in life, they will need to go back to that crawling stage to learn those skills. So it's exactly the same for attachment. So if they miss a stage, it's likely they will fall back into that stage later on. So I think that again is something that we can have a look at, maybe develop some case studies to support with that. And we have one that I can share with you here, and this is a real life case study about Lucy. So Lucy started at the setting at 2 years old, and the key person noticed through observation that Lucy was hyper vigilant to noises from outside, and this would stop her from playing, and she would run to investigate what was going on, even though nobody else had heard that sound or any noises coming from outside. Lucy communicated with her key person, but would avoid eye contact and would make no reaction to being dropped off at the nursery. The key person spoke to Lucy's carer about the concerns that she had in terms of Lucy's development, and the carer confirmed that at home, Lucy would rarely seek comfort. She confided that she would often curl up for a story and then abruptly hit the carer in the face. So what concerns would you identify here? So using the chat box, from that little scenario, from that little case study, what would you identify as a concern, and what would you do next? So yeah, we may need to look at what's impacted the relationship with the carer. We might be, who might the key worker speak to for guidance? So yeah, so the key worker, the key person, may be working with that child but has never worked with a child who has attachment disorder before. And Lucy has had attachment disorder. She's undiagnosed and the symptoms are similar to early signs of ADHD and autism. Lucy was fostered and later adopted, and the setting were not completely informed of the background and did not consider the impact on Lucy due to her being so young. And that is a common scenario because often you're not even fully informed as the carer that taking on that child, so you might not have the full background and there might be triggers for that child that you will never know. The common mistake that can be made is that because the child is so young, maybe even newborn when they're adopted or fostered, that there's no effect from earlier for them on their attachment in the early days or a traumatic attachment. But in fact, the brain remembers and the impact can show further into the child's life. So Lucy lashed out when feeling love because she'd never felt it. And she was adopting a self-preservation approach, which, you know, is your survival mode. So Lucy was almost testing her own hypotheses. If I hurt you, will you continue to love me? And although it's never too late to treat and repair attachment issues, the earlier you spot the symptoms of an insecure attachment and take steps to repair them, the better. Caught in infancy before they become more serious problems, attachment disorders are often easy to correct with the right help and support. And again, thinking about that plasticity of the brain, allowing for reconnection of synapses, reprogramming of the brain. Really interesting to explore that as well, because then of course we can start to link that back to the theories that we know about strong attachments. So let's have a look at theory into practice, which we've sort of embedded all the way through today so far. But the main way in which attachment theory can be applied into practice is through everyday interactions with the children, and not forgetting with the families attending the setting as well, and through the key person approach. I often say that you're not just key person to the children, you're key person to the family. And it's really that three-way communication that is going to make that attachment in the setting really strong. So the early years foundation stage of 2021, as I said, hasn't changed, but it states in 3.27 of the safeguarding and welfare requirements that each child must be assigned a key person, and their role is to help ensure that every child's care is tailored to meet their individual needs, to help the child become more familiar with the setting, offer a settled relationship with the child, and build a relationship with their parents. So this could be that you open it up into a group discussion about what this means to them and how this could be applied to practice. What does this mean to the students? How could this be applied to practice? And it's another opportunity to share some of these wonderful case studies that we've talked about today, and from your own practice and real life examples, because that's where the kinesthetic learners in particular will really think about that example and apply some of the theory. And again, as I said, going back to basics, thinking about you know, smiling and saying hello and remembering names and all those really basic things that mean a lot to a child and family. There are some reflective questions that we could also look at with the students. As a group, they could explore these. They could be split into small groups to talk about these, or feedback as a whole group. You know, it's entirely up to you what would work best. But some of these questions would be: how do you ensure that your settings policy for the key person approach is effective for the children and families? So as we were saying before, lots of settings will take on a different approach for the key person procedure. So whether it is divided out between the children are divided out between the key person, or whether there's buddies. Sometimes they'll have a buddy system where if somebody's off, you know, another key person will take over. So some places will have the same key person throughout the whole time in the setting, because they will move with them when they move to different rooms. They will have transition to different key person if they're moving rooms, if they don't do that. So lots and lots of things there with settings policies, and if they're not already in placement, There are lots of setting policies online that you could download and talk about and compare. How does this quote link with the theories that have been researched? So the quote about the EYFS, you know, each child being assigned a key person, where does that come from? How can you link it to research that we discussed earlier on? What improvements could be made to ensure that the attachment theory is embedded further? So I think this one is really important at the moment because there has been a lot of changes throughout the pandemic of how children are dropped off at the setting. So some settings have stopped parents from coming in and they're just dropping off on the door, and they've found that much better. And so they've continued it afterwards as well, after we've sort of gone back to come out of using bubbles and gone back to a little bit of normality. So there's a lot to explore there of how improvements could be made to that particular setting and how it can change for every child, because we always have that child that will attend the setting that will be a little bit more difficult to settle, and what you can do for that child as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Janet now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacey. So I think these next sort of questions are very reflective, and they're almost asked of a key person. So these are the sorts of questions that you could think about maybe with a group of students, you know, who've been on placement. And you could also relate this to older children, of course, in terms of interaction with the teacher, with the teaching assistant, and so on. And that sort of value, when were the touch points? When do you think quality interactions took place with the key child and the key person, or with children and individual children and a teaching assistant and or teacher throughout the day? What did you see that might be an indication of a positive relationship that these individuals have? What about the family and so on? And then thinking about maybe themselves as students in their own stage of development and their own stage in terms of the qualification that they're studying. What skills do I have that make me sort of the skills that would transfer over to that critical, important role of a key person, of a teaching assistant or teacher, the value of that relationship, and what do I need to learn more about, and so on. And you're thinking there about the importance of being a professional role model. So that again brings more things into the conversation. And allows you to have really rich discussions to talk about ways that they can improve their own personal development, and how important it is to actually, you're not being just friendly and approachable, albeit that's really important with children and families, but you have got that critical, serious business of a positive professional relationship, and how important that can be for the child's future and the way that a parent may feel. Okay, let's just move on to the next slide then and remind ourselves of what we were aiming to achieve in the webinar. So we were hoping to identify attachment theories that can be used in education and childcare, describing how attachment theories can be applied in practice, and finally reflecting on the effectiveness of key person systems, how they may be improved using those series of attachment, and significantly, how a student is able to identify moments that show positive affirmations of a relationship that is strong, that is positive, that is allowing for attachment, those things that go with attachment: security, a sense of belonging, self-esteem, feeling valued, feeling comfortable, able to contribute, able to participate, able to have a go, that have a go factor. Maybe right, maybe wrong. I'm going to contribute my answer because I know the other person is going to listen and value what I have to say. So when do students find those opportunities, and how do we actually allow for that sort of security, that feeling, and so on, within our own classroom environment where everybody feels they can contribute as well? We have on the next slide, we've got some further reading and referencing there that you could explore. And of course, don't forget to have a look at the video clips. And also, you know, just remember students will also, if they're on placement, whether that's in a primary school, secondary school, or indeed in the early years settings, that if they've been on placement, they will be able to relate to this and remember the importance of scenarios, remember the importance of discussions, asking questions, thinking, all of those metacognitive skills that are going to help students in the external assessment as well. So you're developing that confidence in sort of abilities there and exam and employer set project skills and preparations, as well as a richer understanding of the subject area. Thank you. Thank you, Helen. I don't know if we have any questions.
I'm just checking the question box. There's a really good point being made about could this be a potentially sensitive subject for teachers to deliver? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. You know, in any class, in any teaching and learning environment, you don't know how a person is feeling. You don't know necessarily about the experiences and the circumstances in which they find themselves. So it is very difficult. There may be young people in that classroom who don't feel that sense of belonging, who don't have that richness from a primary giver who's unconditionally there for them. And that's, you know, that is something perhaps we all always need to remind ourselves of. So it's absolutely a sensitive subject. And I think the fact that actually, you know, the brain is an amazing thing, and we can actually, if we can appreciate and recognize that attachment may be lacking, may be weak, then there's networks of support that can actually help that. It doesn't matter when. The brain is an amazing thing. So it's knowing that, looking out for signs of vulnerability, but also having an appreciation of individual circumstance. Absolutely.
Thank you. And there's another one about how much do you think social deprivation has impact on attachment?
Massive. I mean, I'll let Stacey come in. I'm hogging the limelight here, aren't I? And I'll pass over to you, Stacey, in a moment. But I think any form of deprivation will have an effect on attachment, any form of deprivation. And so the social deprivation, and I'm not talking COVID, I'm talking about something that is a long term, where not only are you having that social deprivation, but you are perhaps that's accompanied by not meeting that child's needs. So not only are you depriving them socially of peer contact and so on, but you know I'm thinking about Jeannie and about the social deprivation that young girl experienced, and that's a real life situation that happened in Los Angeles. And again, you can look at that and explore the nature nurture side of attachment with that. But any form of deprivation will have a massive impact. I don't know, Stacey, if you want to add to that at all.
No, I completely agree, and I think it's very current, isn't it, with the social deprivation that we've all been through, and I think it's changed us quite a lot, and I think that does change the relationships that you have. I think looking at things like the Romanian orphanages and looking at how that impacts on children, even in terms of sort of positive touch and having hugs and things like that, you know, that can have a massive effect. I think there's so much to unpick here, but I think it would be really interesting to look at some of these things with the students, because I think they're all very relevant to what we're doing with children today.
Absolutely.
That's
Thank
all the
you.
questions that we had.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending the webinar and for listening. And if you have any questions, you know where we are. We hope you have an enjoyable rest of day. Thank you from us. Goodbye.